And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Tonight's weather showing this fairly strong storm here coming across the eastern Aleutians to the Alaska Peninsula, actually very close to Sand Point there. So strong winds coming into Kodiak Island with big increase in both the wind and rain, Kodiak Island into Bristol Bay. And then north winds becoming northerly and increasing here for the central Aleutians. Quiet for the most part over the interior with some light snow up in the northeast part of the state. Light snow continues north slope Arctic coast on down into the Bering Strait to about St. Lawrence Island. And rain changes to showers for the Panhandle. And that should lead to a dry day tomorrow for the southeast coast with maybe some sunshine early on. Otherwise, the afternoon will be seeing increasing winds and lowering and thickening clouds as this system begins to push eastward. Otherwise, Kodiak Island has a high wind watch out for possible gusts 75 miles an hour out of the east. That would be ahead of this front. And look for strong winds also to push into the Kenai Peninsula, south central Alaska, Prince William Sound. Back around Bristol Bay, high wind warning for the eastern Aleutians. North winds gusting 75 miles an hour, high wind watch for the Alaska Peninsula. 75 mile an hour wind gusts there as well. Fair in the interior. And for the Saturday outlook here, low pressure moves up into the western Alaska range, give or take here. And that puts a pretty good gradient here across the Kenai Peninsula and toward Prince William Sound. So look for some pretty gusty winds through the across the area here with rain, heavy at times, rain and high wind warnings out for the central and southern southeast coast for gusts 60 miles an hour. Again, with rain heavy at times associated with that front as it presses in during actually late Friday night, actually early Saturday through Saturday afternoon. Strong northerly winds out here across the Bering Sea all the way from actually the interior coming down and then southward here. Still pretty gusty, starting to come down a little bit for the eastern Aleutians, but not too much. Stays pretty windy for the Alaska Peninsula. And you can see those winds extend all the way up to the Bering Strait. And still a chance of snow for the North Slope and Arctic coast. And for tonight, look for east winds, 40 to 50 knots on the north coast of the Panhandle, or that's for Friday, not tonight. And east winds increasing, 25 to 30 knots on the south coast. Otherwise, Lynn Canal, north winds 15 knots with higher gusts, southeast 15 for Stevens Passage, and Clarence Strait, southeast winds 20 knots with 4-foot seas. And for Saturday, gale warnings all along the coast here for south to southeast winds 40 to 50 knots, seas up around 20 feet or so. And small craft advisories to gale warnings for the inside waters, all southeast, anywhere from 30 to 45 knots in gusts, with seas running 7 to 13 feet. North Gulf Coast tomorrow, storm warnings, east winds 50 to 60 knots. Prince William Sound, gale warning, east winds 35 knots, seas 9 feet. And Cook Inlet, northeast winds 40 to 45 knots. With seas 10 to 15 feet, highest south of the Forelands. In Kamishak Bay, northeast winds 55 knots with 20-foot seas. And for Saturday, northeast winds 30 knots for Cook Inlet, seas 7 feet. Small craft advisories now for Kamishak Bay and the Barren Islands, north winds at 25 knots. Gale warnings for the western North Gulf Coast, east winds 35 knots, seas just under 20 feet. And storm warnings for the eastern North Gulf Coast continue southeast at 50 knots with seas just under 30 feet. Prince William Sound, gale warnings, east winds 40 knots, seas 12 feet. And for Kodiak Island, east and northeast winds tomorrow. Good for storm warnings, 50 to 60 knot winds there with seas 18 to 19 feet. Storm warnings here for the Alaska Peninsula and Bristol Bay for 50 to 60 knot winds northeast here, Bristol Bay and the Bering Sea side of the peninsula. Otherwise, northeast and northwest on the Pacific side. And then for Saturday, northwest winds 25 to 45 knots for the Alaska Peninsula. And for Bristol Bay, those winds coming down northwest diminishing to 20 knots, seas subsiding to 6 feet. And Kodiak Island, northeast winds 20 to 25 knots. And for the eastern Aleutians tomorrow, storm warnings, North to northwest winds 50 to 55 knots with seas running 10 to 26 feet. Adak and Atka, storm warnings, north winds 50 knots, seas 11 to 20 feet. And for the western Aleutians, north winds 30 to 35 knots. And for the day on Saturday, western Aleutians, northwest winds 30 knots here, actually for Amchitka Island. West of Amchitka, east-southeast 20 to 30 knots. And for Adak and Atka, gale warnings, northwest 40 knots, seas up to 20 feet. Eastern Aleutians, northwest winds 45 to 50 knots with seas 10 to 24 feet. And for the southwest coast tomorrow, gale warnings, northeast winds 35 to 40 knots, northeast 30, St. Lawrence Island, northeast 25 in Norton Sound. Now over the Bering Sea, we've got northerly winds, 50-knot northerlies, good for storm warnings there for the Pribilof Island, seas around 20 feet, and about 40 knots for St. Matthew Island. And for the day Saturday, north winds 45 knots for St. Matthew Island, northwest 45 with 25-foot seas for the Pribilofs, and the southwest coast here as well, St. Lawrence Island and Norton Sound, all looking at gale force northerly winds 40 to 45 knots. And for the eastern Arctic coast tomorrow, light west winds at 5 to 10 knots, and then light northerly winds on the central coast at about 10 knots, seas about 3 feet, north 15 with 4-foot seas for the western Arctic coast. Small craft advisories here with 4 to 9 foot seas to go with that north wind of 25 knots for the Chukchi Sea. And then even stronger winds in the forecast for Saturday here for the Chukchi Sea, north to northeasterlies at 30 to 40 knots with seas running 7 to 12 feet. And for the western Arctic coast, northeast winds 25 knots, 5-foot seas. Central Arctic coast, northeast at 20 with 4-foot seas. And small craft advisories here for the eastern Boulevard Sea coastline. East to northeast winds 25 knots with 5-foot seas.